First, we will have our hearing on Senate Bill 31, which is excluding USD number 207, Fort Leavenworth, and virtual school students from the capital improvement state aid determination. After that, we will be working Senate Bill 185. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's call on Tamara Lawrence, our reviser, to give us a brief overview on Senate Bill 31. And are we ready?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Senate Bill 31 would amend the calculation of capital improvements state aid, otherwise known as bond and interest state aid, to exclude USD number 207 Fort Leavenworth and students enrolled in a virtual school offered by a school district. Capital improvement state aid is determined by multiplying a school district's bond and interest obligation by the district's state aid percentage. To determine a district's state aid percentage, the state board ranks each school district by their assessed valuation per pupil, or AVPP. The lowest AVPP is the point of beginning, and the school district that is ranked lowest receives a 75% state aid percentage. Then for every $1,000 in AVPP above that lowest AVPP, the state aid percentage is reduced for those school districts by 1%. Current law includes Fort Leavenworth School District in the AVPP ranking and also includes virtual school students in the calculation of a school district's AVPP. So in this bill, I'll touch first on the Fort Leavenworth issue and then the virtual school student issue. So for bond elections held on or after July 1, 2021, Senate Bill 31 would exclude the Fort Leavenworth School District from the AVPP schedule used to calculate the bond and interest state aid. Currently, Fort Leavenworth is included, but because it is situated on federal property, it has the lowest AVPP of all school districts, and it does not have the authority to actually issue bonds. Senate Bill 31 would remove Fort Leavenworth from that calculation. And so the next lowest school district with the lowest AVPP would receive that 75% state aid percentage. So for virtual school students, currently the AVPP calculation of a school district includes those students who are enrolled in a virtual school offered by such school district. Under Senate Bill 31, for bond elections held on or after July 1, 2021, students enrolled in a virtual school as defined in the Virtual School Act would be excluded from the school district's AVPP determination. Senate Bill 31 would take effect upon publication in the statute book, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, are there any questions? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. It is there. Another way that you can look for it is if you go to Kansas Ledge and just look for Senate bills, you'll find it there also. Okay, so we are going to move forward. We have several proponents, and I do want the committee to know that this is a bill that we heard last year. In fact, it passed unanimously in the Senate, went over to the House. I don't know what the vote was on that. I thought it got out of committee, but I don't know that it got to the floor. Did it get to the floor? Okay, there we go. So first up, we have virtual testimony. It's with Dustin Avey, Managing Director for Piper Sandler and Company. And I want the committee to know and the public to know that several school districts thought that there was a problem with this because it would reshuffle each year, but couldn't figure out why it was shifting the way that it was. And it actually was Dustin Avey that took the time and did the research and came actually to the legislature with the solution. So Dustin, if you can go ahead and begin your testimony, please. We can't hear you, Dustin.
Here we go. You hear me now, Madam Chair?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Good to see you, committee members. Nice to be in front of you again. And as it was alluded to, we appreciate the opportunity to be in front of the committee a year ago and also this year. As you've heard from the reviser and Tamara, great job on the explanation and the details of the current law and also the proposed bill, I thought it maybe be helpful to just review how is capital improvement state aid applicable to school districts, and how does it differ by school districts, and what is the impact directly as a result of where we were before the law changed and where we are today. So maybe as just an example, so obviously capital improvement state aid is meant to equalize school district based upon assessed valuation per pupil. So when school districts want to build buildings or remodel buildings or make capital improvements, and they need to fund those improvements with a bond issue, that bond issue is subject to voter approval. And so school districts therefore have elections. Once the election gets approved, bonds are issued for a project and financed over a certain period of time, oftentimes 20, 25, or 30 years. State aid or capital improvement state aid is not used for helping build or remodel or pay for projects. Capital improvement state aid is used to help offset the bond payment and therefore offsetting the local mill levy requirement. So for an example, if a school district had an annual bond payment of $1 million and that school district received 25% state aid, the state of Kansas would be paying approximately $250,000 of that payment, and the balance would be paid from local taxpayers. What we need to look at is so obviously there's a mill levy difference or a tax difference, right? So again, like hypothetically, if that same district had a valuation of 100 million, okay, the mill levy without that state aid would be 10 mills, okay? The mill levy impact when we equalize that district is now 7.5 mills, okay? So there is a local tax impact as a result of the law. So I think it's important as we think about the proposed changes, we also then recognize the differences between where we were before 15 and why the change was made in 15. And I don't know that anybody who's either listening or in the room would disagree that the intent of the change in 15 is appropriate. I think that the intent was to provide a better way for the state to manage the budget related to capital improvement state aid. So I think the intent of the law is correct. And until you actually start practicing the law, that's when you kind of figure out is all the variables and the changes being made, is it appropriate and is it working? And so that's why we've started obviously the evaluation process and came before the legislature a year ago to propose some changes that would fix the law that we think works. But if we look at, I guess first of all, not every school district gets capital improvement state aid. Okay. In fact, there's as a revisor had indicated, we measure whether school districts are eligible for capital improvement state aid by wealth in Kansas. That's kind of the model that we've been using to evaluate and determine wealth for each school district. And that wealth, as alluded to earlier, is based upon assessed valuation per pupil. So when we look at the pre-2015 law, what we did is we took the wealth factor, right, the assessed valuation per pupil for all Kansas school districts, and we developed what a median was, and we compared everybody to that median. So if I belong to a school district where my wealth or my assessed valuation per pupil equaled the median, I would get 25% of my annual bond payment paid for by the state. If I were 1,000 poorer than the median, I would get 1 percentage point more. If I was 1,000 wealthier than the median, I get 1 percentage point less. So what's interesting about this, I think the concept here is, again, every school district across the state is different. Everybody has a different assessed valuation per pupil or wealth factor. And it was a way for us in Kansas to compare districts and appropriately equalize school district based upon that factor. So the change in 15 then taking a step, well, let me give you a couple statistics real quick, and this is also my testimony that you may have before you. If we look at school districts who were eligible for capital improvement state aid under the prior law, so before the 2015 law change, there were 200 school districts eligible for that under that formula in 2015-16. Today, there's about 185. Okay, so again, pretty consistent, right? We've lost a couple school districts based upon what's happened with their valuation and their enrollment, et cetera. But for the most part, pretty consistent. So again, in 15, we just said we need a better system or better formula for being able to manage the state's expense related to capital improvement state aid. And so therefore, we didn't change how we determined wealth. Okay, so that is still assessed valuation per pupil. What we did is we took away the median calculation and just said the poorest district in the state, so the district that gets the most state aid, would be capped at 75%. So what's happened, and obviously that district, so under the median calculation, that poorest district is Fort Leavenworth. But in the median calculation, Fort Leavenworth is really does not move the median because it's the poorest school district. But when we switched it and said we're going to cap the poorest district, that made Fort Leavenworth kind of the standard for which all other school districts would be equalized. Well, as you may be aware, under statutes, Fort Leavenworth does not have any bonding ability. So they have no ability to go out and issue bonds for capital projects. And primarily that's because they're obviously heavily funded through the federal government, given that they're on the base. And so what's happened, and again, it took us a couple of years to see what these trends look like and what was happening. But every single year, what's happening is Fort Leavenworth is getting poorer on a per pupil basis compared to the rest of the state. So hypothetically, if Fort Leavenworth could issue bonds, which they can't, but if they could issue bonds, this fiscal year, the state of Kansas would be paying them 107% of their annual bond payment, okay, under the pre-15 law. Now, because after 2015 law, now what we're doing is we're capping that school district at 75%, right? So we're going from 100% to 75%, then every school district in the state drops by 32 percentage points. Okay, so it's a very drastic shift in equalization, which is, again, it's really caused the challenge, right? That's the premise of what we're trying to evaluate and fix is Fort Leavenworth being included in the formula doesn't necessarily make sense because they can't issue bonds, but it's really making it's really making it inequitable for those districts that would have been eligible for capital improvement state aid. They're now getting very little. As an example, right? So we talked about school districts that under the old law, the pre-15 law, that are getting capital improvement state aid. If we look at the after 15 law, in 2015-16, so after the law was changed, there was 159 school districts eligible for state aid, capital improvement state aid, under that new law. As Fort Leavenworth has been getting poorer on a per pupil basis compared to the state, for this fiscal year, 2020-21, there are only 115 school districts eligible for capital improvement state aid. So as you can see, a fairly drastic difference in change in the equity related to the intent of what the law is. And there's, my testimony has some data with respect to if we don't address this particular issue, we would suspect that in the next 5 years we may drop another 20 districts who are currently eligible, but because of where the trends of Fort Leavenworth may not be eligible in future years. So I'm gonna pause there. And again, I don't know that first of all, again, I think just to reiterate, the intent of the after 15 law is appropriate. I think it just, again, we've studied the data, we've evaluated, we see what the challenge is, and I think there's a very appropriate way to fix that and make it correct.
Very much, Dustin. At this time, I'm going to call on Quentin Brees, Superintendent, USD 333, Concordia Public Schools. And we are so glad that you're with us today. I'm glad to be here. Let's turn on that mic.
There we go. There we go.
Okay, talk right into the microphone so that virtual can hear you.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you. Is anybody else head spinning after Dustin lets you guys? I've been in education for 20 years, and probably the last 5 I've served as a superintendent, and that is what school finance looks like on a daily basis, whether you're looking at bond and interest or looking at general fund or looking at capital outlay. There's just some interesting intricacies that make it work. And so for you guys to try to dissect that and understand it in a few short minutes, we appreciate your attention to that. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on how this impacts Concordia Public Schools individually. Again, my name is Quentin Brees, Superintendent of Schools for Concordia Public Schools. And we have undergone an interesting year, to say the least. And what I'd first like to do is thank you all for your tremendous support over the last 3 years, because it has had a tremendous impact following the Gannon decision on whether we were able to function really this past year as a school district. We were able to put back staff over the last 3 years, not in preparation for this, but we were able to just put back staff. And so really that was a huge benefit to us, and it enabled us to continue to do in-person instruction all the way through this school year, so forth. So, you know, with just subs and staffing and managing quarantines and those kind of things, your guidance and your diligent leadership made that happen. Concordia is a community of about 5,000 people, Northwest Kansas. Our school district serves about a 55% free and reduced rate. So we do certainly have some challenges. We have about 1,200 students in our district. We have about 350 to 60 staff members, as we also host the co-op, special education cooperative. So that's just a little bit of an understanding of what Concordia looks like as a district. The median value of a home in Concordia is $73,000. So when you start talking about mills and what those dollars generate, 1 mill will generate about $70,000 in Concordia Public Schools. So much different than maybe a more affluent community that has a lot of you know, big businesses or you know, $4 or $5 million homes. Obviously drives assessed valuation up. So the state aid is very near and dear to my heart as we're trying to make plans in Concordia to do some improvements on Concordia Public Schools. We have a 1929 high school that has been serving us well for the past almost 100 years, but it needs some TLC, and that TLC costs a lot of dollars. And I want to make sure, I don't want to go on a tangent, but I want to make sure you guys as a committee understand we have capital improvement state aid that we're talking about today. There's another fund that some people get confused, and my own community got confused, and so I tried to explain that to them. Capital outlay is a whole different budget. And so, for instance, capital outlay is what we currently use to maintain our facilities. Capital outlay in Concordia, Kansas, we do the max there. We assess our taxpayers, our local tax base, 8 mills. And like I said, at $75,000 per mill, that generates about $600,000 for us to manage 4 buildings, a bus fleet and passenger vehicle fleet of 30. And we just bought a new bus here just a few months ago, and you know that's $110,000 by the time we outfit that bus with our seats for our young preschool children with the car seats and so forth. So that $600,000 per year doesn't go a long way. So I would comment that our staff have done a fantastic job of maintaining this 1929 structure, but we're at the point now that it's going to take millions of dollars rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring it up to snuff. And so to speak, the challenge with those dollars is I have to assess those all to my local tax base. And we have obviously a city tax, a county tax. We have a community college that assesses 30 mills to our local tax base. So really, we've found that this state aid is about our only option to help mitigate what's happening. And we started years ago, before 15, being about a 49% state aid district. So if we ran a $30 million bond issue, approximately half of that would be funded with some equalization. We're all the way down to almost 14% now, and that makes it really difficult for us to sustain and be able to make plans to move forward with from a building standpoint. So again, that equalization aid is so very important to us, and how we need to do that. You throw in the contentiousness of a local taxing entity trying to run a bond issue. And many of you know that have been in communities. That always creates contentiousness anyway when I'm going to change something, or the high school's been there for 29 years and it served a lot of generations. And so there's a lot of those generations that tell me it was fine for them when they were there. But our classrooms are small, they're 900 square feet. Most classrooms now are built to about, 1,200 to 1,300 square feet. We're dealing with a gas line issue right now that wasn't planned, that ruptured here over the weekend. And so there's just a lot of things that we need to address, and we've been working diligently for the past 10 years on a plan, and we always get to the point where the number comes out and we lose our traction with our community because we just can't afford it. And we've done this again for 10 years, and now it seems like it becomes more important to everybody in the community once something bad happens and with the facility. So whether a roof goes bad and we have to move school, or a gas line goes bad, or we had luckily there was no students hurt, but we had an issue with a ramp collapsing, and students were on it during a fire drill, and luckily nobody was hurt. But again, it's those things that we're trying to anticipate every move. And probably most recently with COVID, we tried to, much like you guys have done here, put in as many precautions as we can. So we've tried to put in bottle filler stations instead of the standard drinking fountains. And so, in our elementary school that was built in '96, that it worked pretty effortlessly. You buy, a $2,000 or $3,000 drinking fountain. Your maintenance guys can go to it and get it installed usually within hours. Within our high school building, housing 650 kids, we still haven't got them in. And it's as you try to install stuff into 1929 infrastructure, we've just run into trouble after trouble after trouble, whether it be asbestos, then a drain pipe caving in, and those things are really challenging. So that's really the sense of urgency that I have before you today as we work through those challenges. I think the constraints that we place on districts with this aid have been revealed over the past 5 years, and I do think it was really unintended consequences from the original bill. I understand where you're coming from on the front end of this. Now that we've lived it for a few years, I think it's identified the challenges that we do have. So again, no action on this bill is going to continue to decrease our state aid by 2 to 3% every single year until we will probably be, like Dustin alluded to earlier, we'll be off the list. And this change does have a significant impact on our planning. So I think it's really important for you to understand the urgency we have in Concordia. And again, I appreciate the time, and a 7 mil difference is what he alluded to that would make for us and our community. I think that's probably on the low end. I think it could be as much as 7 or 8 mils, maybe even 9, as we continue to go through the calculation. I think one concern I heard in the previous bills, and I think I wrote them down, is House Bill 2526 last year, which you alluded to, and then Senate Bill 382, which was heard in this committee that we passed out. I think a concern last year was about the funding. The state would have to fund this. The way I understand it and the way I've read this is it's really hard to gauge the exact dollar amount that it would cost the state, because as, for instance, if Concordia would go on, there, over the next several years, there's going to be school districts that come off. So really, I believe in my calculation and Dustin's calculation, I think Dustin can correct me, but I do believe this is a budget neutral. I don't believe it's going to cost the state any dollars. It's really hard to put a hard number on that, just because we don't know, if Concordia passes the bond and then Spring Hill comes off, and have 286 school districts that can shuffle around, but it usually as some come off and some come on. And so nobody knows that until the election is actually passed. So I do believe that is a strong reason to strongly consider this bill, to get it through, because the sense of urgency continues, and we all know costs continue to rise every year. What was going to cost me almost $30 million 10 years ago is going to cost the district probably nearly 50 to 60 for almost the same scope of work in a 10-year span. So we're seeing huge increases in cost, and we really want to battle for our kids. But again, I thank you for your time and listening to me ramble a little bit this afternoon, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you for your leadership and your compassion. We have one more piece of testimony and then we'll ask questions. Okay, thank you, Quentin. We have Mark Tallman, Associate Executive Director, Kansas Association of School Boards. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee, when I try to explain things like this to my members and I look around a room like this, I never know whether people completely understand it or have no idea what we're talking about. So I think it's been really well explained, but I think I'll just maybe try to frame it as simple, because it's how I remember. Under this formula, the percentage of aid you get is determined by how many $1,000 per pupil you are above Fort Leavenworth. And Fort Leavenworth is pretty much always zero, because it's a military base that has no valuation per pupil. But almost every other district in the state that does have valuation tends to rise every year, just because the amount of valuation is going up. So that just means what you've heard simply is that unintended consequence is that every year most districts are wealthier than Fort Leavenworth. I mean, they're more wealthier. Maybe not compared to each other, but they get farther away from zero every year. And so the point of this bill is to say, instead of starting the calculation at a district that never moves, we're going to exclude the only district with essentially no valuation, start at the second lowest, and then assume from there, under kind of the natural course of things, it will rise a little bit, and that will compensate the difference of everyone else. So that's just the idea behind this, to use the same principle, but not use the district that is really an anomaly. And if we don't do that, what the rest of my testimony says is, it just means that over time, every other district will tend to get less state aid, or a lower percentage, which has to be filled by property tax, which means the gap between districts, between wealthy and less wealthy districts, will get wider, and that creates the funding inequity that's the concern. So with that, I'll be happy to take questions at the appropriate time if there are any.
Thank you very much. Committee, what question? Let me just point out, we do have 7 pieces of written proponent testimony. We have no neutral testimony, and we have opponent testimony. So now we'll get to questions that we have, and we'll start with Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure which one of you the question's for, either Mark or Quentin. So essentially, we're throwing out an outlier. We're throwing out the lowest in our range. Why wouldn't we throw out the highest in that range also, which I would assume would be Blue Valley?
One thing to remember is...
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mark Tallman, Kansas Association of School Boards. Remember, it's assessed valuation per pupil. So Blue Valley is not the highest. It's really always Burlington because of their nuclear power plant. But the point is, those districts at the high end don't get any aid anyway. And so throwing out the top wouldn't really affect you. The only starting point is if you use this formula, which uses, the old one used the median, this just is a bottom starting point, then I think that's the one you really need to worry about, because whenever you get a certain dollar per pupil above your starting point, everyone above that is zero. And so now probably, and Dustin may be able to tell me, 25% of districts don't get any state aid because they're already so high. They get zero.
Other questions? And Dustin, did you want to jump in? How many is it right now that do not receive any state aid?
Again, Dustin Avey with Piper Sandler. Under the current law, there are only 115 school districts that are eligible to receive state aid. I do agree with Mr. Tallman's comment related to Mrs. Schwartz's question.
That would be 171 that received no state aid.
Madam Chairperson, there's in that testimony, there's some good information that may be helpful to the committee too, that talks about and evaluates who those districts are, because it does, again, maybe some of your districts that you represent as well. So there is that information in your testimony.
Thank you. Other questions, committee? Yes, Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is for any of the conferees. I have a few questions, Madam Chair, if there aren't any others, if I may. What fund does the capital improvement money come from? The state fund? Or SGF?
Mark Tallman from KASB. I believe it is a demand, well, JG could tell you, it is a transfer from the general fund. So it kind of comes from the general fund, but it's a transfer before you start appropriating. So it comes out kind of before it gets into the general fund, or it's the first thing taken out, I believe.
JG, can you verify that for us, please? We can't hear you. We still can't hear you, JG.
Can you hear now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. It is a demand transfer. So money's deposited into the state general fund. There's a calculation that's made on how much needs to be paid for capital improvement state aid. That amount is certified by the Department of Education and transferred from the state general fund to the Department of Education to be distributed.
Follow up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I know that we don't have a fiscal note on this bill because of the variables that have been explained. However, I would venture to say that this would have a fairly hefty price tag for some of the following reasons. I believe that one of the conferees said that their state aid went from about 45% down to 14%, and I would imagine that's been the same across the board for these school districts. Having been a school board president when a bond issue was put forth, one of the big selling points to the community is the fact of the state aid, the matching fund. And so I would imagine it's hard to tell, some would go off, but if we were to do this and that percent went way back up, I can almost guarantee we would see a lot of school districts all of a sudden say, hey, capital improvement aid is way back up. Let's do a bond issue because we're going to get this money and we don't know how long it's going to last. So I would venture to say that this is going to come with a big price tag. And my concern is, one, I don't think anyone's debating or disputing that Leavenworth is a legitimate school district. Two, at a time when we're cutting our university's budgets 5.5% and all the demands we have, my concern is without knowing a pretty good fiscal note on this, that this is the time to do this. And so I will leave it there, Madam Chair, for anyone who would like to respond or address that. Thank you.
If we could have some response, and then committee, I'm going to remind you, we are going to need to pivot to working our bill within the next 5 minutes, but I do see Superintendent Brees, did you want to address that?
I believe Dustin may want to address this too, but quickly, I will say, I think one of the differences between the past bills that we also looked at was being aware of that challenge. And so I think between Dustin and several superintendents trying to figure out a solution to help mitigate that change would be the addition that's in the bill regarding virtual state aid. And, you know, kind of an ethical decision too, and we know this during COVID, but we're removing the students that are counted as virtual from the calculation. And so ethically, I think that's probably the right thing to do and should be that way, because we're not building bricks and mortar bought and interest state aid, so to speak. We're not building that for virtual students because they're online. So part of what was put into this bill is eliminating counting those students within that calculation, which is going to change the assessed valuation per pupil. So that will help mitigate that change. And again, I do believe that there's going to be other districts coming off at the same time as some are going on. But I think you have a valid point on the fiscal note. But we try to take that into account by mitigating that with the virtual student aid piece.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for you. What is the actual spending per pupil in your school district, and what is the enrollment in your school district doing? Is it increasing or decreasing?
We've been pretty consistent for an enrollment standpoint. I would say my first few years as superintendent, we went from 996 students up to over 1,100. We're trending around that 1,200 mark, 1,190-ish, and that obviously fluctuates daily. But we've been pretty steady as a school district in that part. As far as our value per pupil, I'd have to probably dig into that a little bit. What specific total dollars per pupil? Our general fund's about $8 million, and divide that by 1,200. You know, and that includes all of our weightings and so forth. I'm sorry, I have to get back to you on that one.
Any other questions? Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks so much for being here. I kind of recall when I was here in 15, so I kind of recall a little bit when we talked about this change in legislation at the time. And so I think it might be helpful if you could just quickly, if you're going to do, like you have a high school built in 1929, and it sounds like you haven't just started this year thinking about what needs to be done for this facility. And so the process that you would go through and the time frame in order to make that determination and how this would play into that decision.
Great question. And essentially, you know, we've been working, I started as a high school principal in 2011 and came upon a building that was struggling a little bit. Moved into the assistant superintendent role and now officially the superintendent over the last 5 years. But we've been through 4 different consultants and 3 different architects and really come to the same conclusion. You build your community together. Senator Erickson probably remembers doing this with trying to involve all your community stakeholders to come forth. So we've done that 3 different times in this last 10-year period, but you know, it is a long process. You know, we've been meeting pre-COVID, we met monthly with our community group to try to identify what the needs were, meeting with architects, trying to figure out what we can save, what we have to raise and tear down and add on. And so it's a pretty lengthy process. And like I said, we've been going through it for probably the last 3 years for this specific project, but it began well before that with a number of facility studies and architects and consultants. That answer your question, Senator?
Thank you very much. Committee, I will, at this time, I'm going to close our hearing on Senate Bill 31. I do want to thank those that were with us today for testimony. And we are going to move on to Senate Bill 185. And so Tamara, if you can give us a brief overview again, that is in reference to the hearing that we had 2 weeks ago on the Kansas Commission for the Deaf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senate Bill 185 would clarify the registration requirements of sign language interpreters with the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. The bill includes provisions related to the registration of interpreters, renewal registrations for interpreters. It would allow for a criminal history record check. It would provide for the denial, suspension, or revocation of interpreter registration. It provides rule and regulation authority for the commission. The bill also provides for the communication access services, service providers, and interpreter service agencies. It also establishes the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Fee Fund and clarifies the Commission's powers and duties. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, what questions do you have at this time? I'm not seeing any questions. Senator Petty.
I'm don't want to be out of order here, but I just wanted to clarify on the bill that you just closed, were there only proponents, no opponents?
Yes, we had no neutral and no opponents.
Thank you.
That's correct. So committee, we are, right now, we are working on Senate Bill 185. If you need to pull that up, take a look at it. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Typically, I'm not in favor of adding more regulation, more licensing. It just seems like a way to generate more money for an association or for a department. And I guess I don't recall, maybe it was said or I didn't understand, what is the purpose? It says that would require the Kansas Commission for the Deaf to establish a sign language interpreter registration process. Has there been an issue with interpreters?
There has been an issue. We have individuals that have not gone through the process, but there also is an interagency problem. And part of what this particular bill does is it establishes the authority for that Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing to establish the process and the fees. So they have for several years been in a state of limbo with regard to interpretation. And so the guidance that we received from the Attorney General was it needed to be stated legislatively. And so that's why we do have this bill before us. Now, with regard to why we want to have a registration, it would be so that we know that the individuals have gone through the process and they have the appropriate training. And so if school districts, if our courts, if our hospitals, if law enforcement are wanting to hire someone, it is someone that has those credentials.
But, and if I may,
Yes.
but if someone decided, like in their church, they have a local person, she has 3 children that are deaf, she's going to offer deaf in the deaf service, she wouldn't be in trouble, the church wouldn't be in trouble.
No, they would not. And we did have that in testimony. It is just specifically if they're being hired in that more technical situation, such as to provide that service for the courts, service for schools, things like that. First, I need to double check because I thought I saw Senator Erickson's hand. No? Okay, so Senator Petty.
I was just going to say on page 4, if you look on page 4, I believe on page 4, after line 30, it does speak to those. You don't have to have a registered interpreter.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Just to sort of add the explanation that you were providing, I would like to note that current law already requires some form of list or registry of persons who are qualified interpreters, and for the provision of regulation and certification of interpreters. Those requirements are already in law. However, the law doesn't provide much more beyond that. There is no specific manner or method for meeting those requirements. So Senate Bill 185 was crafted to address those requirements and provide a manner and method for the regulation and registration of interpreters.
Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if someone who has been working as an interpreter informally for the past, let's say, 30 years, would they be required to go back for additional training and, in addition to that, pay fees and register in order to continue the work that they've been doing?
I think, Tamara, does it matter what the context of the work they're doing?
If they are interpreting pursuant to state or federal law, they should be a registered interpreter. And that the requirements for that registration would be established by the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing.
I think, again, it depends on when we are looking at what that role is, because we do, as was pointed out by Senator Petty, there are those individuals that are providing services for religious, or they're interpreting services for religious events, a volunteer without compensation, a student who's enrolled in and pursuing a degree, things like that. So it would really depend on what it is. I know that we have, our current director is there. I didn't know if Robert Cooper wanted to weigh in on this.
I'm just here to answer any questions that you have. So I think we're on a good path. Really, all the interpreters, we already have them in the system. There's not going to be a change to that. We want to make sure that the new interpreters that are coming in show that they have the skills and the qualifications to be able to do the job. The school districts have done a really good job of taking care of their own. So there's a few different places that we have seen that we need to get around working with these interpreters. We've had some issues with finding unqualified interpreters, working in a few school districts, but not too many, where we're mostly working on the interpreters that are abusing the system that we currently have. We have like 4 unqualified people that are going to court, and we did manage to contact them and to let them know you're not certified, you can't do court type of work. They're going to these other court systems, and so we've been seeing the same thing happening sometimes in the K through 12. They usually don't last very long. The school districts will get them out of there pretty quickly, but it can make a big impact if they're not. But we're mostly looking at the new people coming in and to seeing what opportunities that we have to gain more interpreters here in the state.
Any additional questions? Committee, do I have a motion to pass out Senate Bill 185?
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to pass out Senate Bill 185, favorable for passage.
I have a motion from Senator Petty. Do I have a second? have a second from Senator Sykes. Is there any further discussion on Senate Bill 185?
I'll just make a comment. If I may.
Okay.
I'd say I'm probably the oldest person in this room, so I'll just take that as a lead there. And so, in the last 10 years now, anything you watch or anything you go to or anything that you've participated in, we have interpreters. And that's, for me, that was suddenly like, oh, there's always an interpreter. And the expectation is that, I'm not hearing impaired and I have no one that's hearing impaired in my family. So, but for those that are, the expectation is that that's the person providing that service is competent and has met certain standards. And I think that this legislation just really does not negate those, in your local church or in a neighborhood meeting, or that you would have someone that doesn't negate that being possible, but it does put in standards so that our deaf and hearing community can make sure that qualified services are being offered when it's very important, like was mentioned in court cases or in school settings. And so I'm sure no matter what committee you're sitting in right now, other than education, you're probably looking at something about regulations. And this is just another area that it just shows that, it's for the well-being of everyone, that there should be some rules and regulations in place for it. And the same is true for sign language.
And I will simply add this. When we look on page 10 of this bill, line 29, it says, provide for a program of statewide coordination for communication access services and service providers. And one of the reasons I think that this is interesting, it's just 2 little lines in an 11-page bill. But it was not until we had this bill on the Senate floor last year that for the first time we had an interpreter on the Senate floor, so that those that were deaf and hard of hearing that were in the audience could actually understand what it was that we were saying and doing during the floor debate. And then you fast forward just a few weeks, and we had the announcement of the shutdown of the state for COVID. And that is when we began in our state actually having interpreters for the press conferences that the leaders in our state were having. It was not until we had COVID. And I do believe that us having the hearing and working the bill last year and actually having interpreters on the Senate floor, that was brought to the public attention, and it was only after that that we had those interpreters that were there for the press releases. In fact, when there was a press conference about a proposal to merge DCF and KDADS last year, and keep in mind that the commissioner works in KDADS, they did not have an interpreter there for that press conference last year. So it is when we talk about, does the action of the legislature really matter? It has certainly mattered during the pandemic that everyone that is watching that press conference, be they deaf or hard of hearing, has access to what is actually being said. So I have a motion. I have a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Motion carries. Committee, I want to say thank you for the work that we got done today. Tomorrow we will have our last hearing before turnaround. If we have time after the hearing, we will work a few bills. I do want us to, so if you have any amendments, please get those in. But we will be working on Senate Bill 63, 93, 144, 173, and 31 that we heard today. So I do want us to work on those. We'll get what we can get done tomorrow if we have time, and then we will work on the remainder on Friday. Yes, Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you be willing to email those as well?
I'm sorry, that list?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
We will get that emailed to you. Any additional questions? Committee meeting is adjourned.